The Observer Effect by R.M. Olson. To Micah. I think you would have enjoyed this one. I miss you, my friend. One thing that must be taken into account in every observation is the observer effect. The fact that observing a situation or a phenomenon will necessarily change the thing being observed, whether in large ways or small. The observation itself affects the outcome. From an introductory physics textbook, São Martim University, Vila Nova do Sol, Colorida. Chapter 1. Iran. The alien jungle was all but silent, even the harsh, unfamiliar cries of the strange birds and the buzz and hum of insects muted. Iran noticed it in the back of his mind, but most of his brain was focused on the threat in front of him. And considering the survival of the entire ragged band of injured survivors behind him depended more or less on him not dying right at the moment, or at the very least, him getting the damn force field back up before he died, he couldn't exactly complain. He crouched carefully, staring into baleful yellow eyes that were almost the size of his entire face. "Easy there, big boy," he whispered, trying to keep his voice as low and unthreatening as possible. The massive jungle cat's tail lashed, and it snorted, hot breath washing thick and heavy over Iran's face. It smelled like rotted meat, which, honestly, was probably a good thing. It meant the animal had eaten recently, at least. Which meant he'd probably been right when he guessed it was more curious than hungry. Although that was still something of an open question. The beast crouched a little, the rippling muscles under its skin as smooth as water, and Iran felt an odd smile spreading across his face, despite, well, everything. "You're beautiful, aren't you?" he murmured, keeping his head turned away to avoid direct eye contact. The creature snorted again and crouched lower. Iran dropped slowly to all fours, trying to keep his body language submissive. His heart was racing, with terror or excitement or both. There were no cats even approaching this size back on Colorida. And despite the fact that it might actually eat him, he could hardly breathe from the sheer, lethal beauty of the animal. "Easy there, beautiful. I don't want to hurt you. I just need you to give me back that force field controller. It's not really good for you anyways," he whispered. He'd never interacted with this particular species before, unless you counted inspecting the dead body Ani, his pet land devil, had left after their crash the previous day, when one had tried to eat Iran and discovered, rather permanently, how bad of an idea starting a disagreement with a protective, great, venomous, tree-dwelling, tentacled land devil was. Iran still felt guilty over it, honestly. The thought of the kind of impact Ani would have on this new ecosystem had woken him from nightmares the previous night. But he'd spent enough time around red-frilled mountain cats back on Colorida that he had a basic idea of how the creature might react. "All right," Iran whispered, stretching his hands out ever so gently towards the cat's mouth, which was now within easy arm's reach. "This is going to be the complicated part, but you're so smart, I'm sure we'll figure it out." His hand was close enough to the huge muzzle that he could almost touch it, the soft breath against his hand hot and strong. He drew in a quick breath, released it slowly, and, as gently as possible, placed his hand on the soft fur. The cat snarled and sprang forward, massive paw slamming into Iran and sending him sprawling in the thick vegetation. He rolled to lay stomach up, tipping his chin backwards to expose his throat, and turning his head away, his pulse pounding in his ears. The beast, still snarling, lowered its head towards his exposed stomach, and his muscles clenched involuntarily at the imagined pressure of those knife-sharp canines, the length of his hand at least. Iran?" Inez's shaky voice came from somewhere behind him. Should I shoot it?" Very, very carefully, Iran squeezed his hand into a fist to activate his wavelink. "No," he murmured, trying not to move his mouth. "Don't do anything yet. I've got everything under control." He hoped desperately that he was telling the truth. Something bumped his side, and he tensed involuntarily, braced for the stabbing agony that was sure to follow the moment his nerves recognized the puncture wound. But it didn't come. He opened one of the eyes he'd squeezed tightly shut, and from the corner of it saw the beast drop its head back to nudge him again with its nose. His heart was pounding so fast he was dizzy with it. "That's my sweet boy," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The animal snorted again, its breath washing over him, and despite his pounding heart, Aran realized there was a giddy grin on his face. The beast was a juvenile, he was fairly sure, judging by its conformation and its behavior. If it had been an adult, this interaction might have gone quite differently. But it was young, and still more curious about the world than defensive. Again, Aran eased his arm upward. "Now," he murmured, "let's try this again. I promise I don't want to hurt you, but that's a force field module you've got in your mouth, and it'll give you a stomach ache." With glacial slowness, he raised his arm. The cat stiffened, and Aran stilled. "All right," he soothed. "We're on the same side, you and me." The cat bumped him again with its nose, and then, with an odd sort of growl, opened its jaws and caught his upraised arm between them. "Aran?" Inez's voice was a terrified squeak. "It's fine," he murmured, his voice shaking slightly. "It's fine. Everything's under control." If the beast closed its jaws, even gently, it would snap Aran's arm like a twig. But for the moment, at least, its mouth was soft, the knife-sharp teeth barely pressing into his skin. And inside its mouth... Yes, he had to bite back a grin of triumph. The module for the force field was wedged between two of the animal's back teeth, within reach of his grasping hand. He closed his fingers around it carefully. "This would definitely have given you a stomachache," he whispered. "Now, I'd really, really appreciate it if you didn't eat me as I get it out. We were getting along so well. It'd be a shame to ruin it." He'd found the module, and he was still alive, which, all things considered, was a minor miracle. He just had to not think too hard about the fact that right now he was lying on the ground with his arm in the mouth of a creature easily 10 times his length, with teeth sharp enough that they punctured skin almost on contact. Because if he did, he would lose his actual crap. The cat moved its head, and Aran let his body go limp, moving with the cat's motion to avoid having his arm torn off at the shoulder. He managed to clamp his fingers around the sensor, and the beast gave a low, coughing snarl, pushing its paw down against his chest. He froze. "Aran, I can't talk right now," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I'm kind of in the middle of... I'm sorry, it's just that... Aran, what the actual hell?" Aran almost whipped his head around and refrained himself just in time. Istve's voice was strangled. Damn it. Istve was his best friend. He and Istve had worked expeditions together for years now. There was no one Aran would rather have on his side, but... Istve had a tendency to overreact to things like this. "Pishti, it's not what it looks like," he managed, still without moving his mouth. "Keep Ani in the backpack." "I can't bloody leave you alone for 5 damn minutes," Istve grumbled. "Here, hold tight, this'll help." Aran paused, trying to relax as the beast rolled his arm between its teeth. "Istve," he tried after a moment. "Give me a sec," said Istve tersely. There was a rustling off to one side. The cat tensed. Then, abruptly, it dropped Aran's arm, and the weight on Aran's chest lifted as the animal bounded into the jungle after whatever distraction Istve had thought up. For a moment, Aran just lay there, limp. Now that the danger was over, every muscle in his body had turned to water, and his heart was pounding so fast he thought he might throw up. There were running footsteps, and before he could turn, Istve had dropped down beside him, sharp worry on their face. "Aran! Talk to me! Are you—" Aran groaned, and with an effort rolled over into a sitting position. "I'm fine, Pishti," he said weakly. Thanks, by the way." Istve let out a long breath, then took him by the shoulders, looking him up and down. "You're bleeding. How badly are you hurt?" Aran glanced down at himself. and realized there were thin trails of blood tracing down his arm where the cat's teeth had broken the skin. He managed a shaky grin. "I'm fine. It's just a scratch. It wasn't trying to bite me or anything, or I'd be picking up your limbs off the damn jungle floor. I don't need a reminder." Istvay sighed. "Come on, let's go before it comes back. I tossed it one of those slug things that Ani killed when I was on my way back, but I doubt that'll hold its attention long." Istvay slipped an arm under Aran's shoulder and pulled him to his feet. Inez was waiting a few steps away with a pulse pistol held in her shaking hand, and Aran managed an encouraging smile in her direction. "Thanks, Inez. You did really well back there." The girl gave him a tremulous smile, and the three of them started back across the small clearing, towards where the huddled survivors, everyone they'd been able to find from the wreck of the diplomatic ship, waited. "Inez told me what happened," said Istvay as they walked. "Did you get the module?" Aran nodded, wiping the drool slime off against his trousers leg. "Let's hope it still works, after all that. We don't have any other force field modules, and with the shape everyone's in, we won't last a standard hour out here without the damn field." He tapped the battered module a couple of times and, holding his breath, hit the button. Across the clearing, the blue force field that had previously made a translucent wall around the survivors flickered up, and then steadied. Aran breathed a long sigh of relief and turned to his friend with a grin. "There. See? I didn't—" He trailed off. Istvay was watching him, their face smudged with dirt and a small streak of blood, eyes dark with concern and focused solely on Aran. And suddenly, Aran was much too aware of the pressure Istvay's arm around his back, the way their dark lashes brushed their cheeks, the rough hint of a beard on their chin, the wisps of black hair pulling out of the ponytail and falling across their face. "Aran!" He blinked and forced himself to look away, only then, remembering to breathe. Yeah, sorry." He was being stupid, like always. Istvay was his friend. And Istvay had made it very clear over the years that that was all they wanted to be. I'll just go inside," Inez said quickly, her eyes flicking between Aran and Istvay. She stepped up to the force field and tapped her wavelink, and the translucent blue field parted to let her through. When she was gone, Istvay shook their head, turning back to Aran with a wry smile. "Should I even ask what happened?" Their voice was still just a little shaky. Aran swallowed and managed a small laugh. "The force field went down, and when I went to check out why, I found that little fellow playing with the component. When he saw me coming, he grabbed it in his teeth, so I had to—" He trailed off again. Istvay was giving him their familiar look, half of exasperation, half of fondness. "You had to go and stick your damn arm in its mouth." They paused. "You know, some people might have just, I don't know, shot it?" Aran frowned, and Istvay chuckled ruefully, still shaking their head. "Sorry, but next time you plan on getting yourself almost eaten by a jungle cat, would you mind at least waiting until I'm close enough to help or something?" Their tone was a forced calm, but Aran could hear the tight worry under it, that flicker of almost panic. "Pishti, I'm fine. I promise, okay?" Istvay managed a wan smile, and Aran sighed to himself. If there was one thing he'd learned over the past few weeks on the diplomatic ship, before it had broken up and stranded all of them here, it was that he'd take almost being killed by dangerous animals any day over the helplessness of watching his best friend fall apart. But the problem was, Istvay seemed increasingly on the verge of falling apart every time it looked like Aran was in any danger at all, which didn't exactly help matters. "So, did you find anything?" he asked at last. Istvay nodded, but Aran could still see the tension around their eyes and mouth. "I found the alien settlement we saw on our equipment. It was right where the sensor said it would be, and whatever lives there, they're definitely a sapient species. They've built a full-on city." They paused. "I didn't try to go in. I thought it would be wiser to come back here first and let everyone know in case something—" They stopped, and Aran felt his own jolt of terror at what might have been if Istvay had been discovered on their own. "Anyways, whatever they are, they have a complex social structure and enough ability to communicate to build a city that could rival any back on Colorida. If Alba wanted someone to negotiate with, I think we found them. And you're all right? Nothing happened to you on the way? Istve snorted softly. That depends on what you define as anything. But considering Ani was acting as my guard dog, nothing was able to hurt me. And how are you feeling after... Istve gave him a small smile. I'm fine. Just a little slower than usual, but I suppose still fast enough to get back here in time to see you in the actual mouth of a jungle cat. Aran closed his eyes in relief. It had been 4 days since Istve had been poisoned. He could still remember the way his friend's face had looked as they lay on the floor in the diplomatic ship's corridor, foam speckling the corners of their lips, skin grayish, heart stuttering weakly as their body fought to keep them alive. And he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to forgive his former classmate turned mutineer, Emmerich, for that. Even after the mutiny, even after the ship breaking up, even after Emmerich's attempt to kill Aran as he fled the dying ship, it was the remembered sight of Istve lying still in the corridor, eyes closed, skin graying, that made Aran want to throw up. Emmerich had been killed when the ship had gone down. At least, he probably had. They had no real way of knowing. But he hadn't been among the survivors Aran had brought back to the clearing the previous day, and anyone who'd tried to face the alien jungle on their own was almost certainly dead by now. Well, I guess the others are lucky you were with them, Istve said at last, their joking tone slightly forced. Here, let me... They took Aran's injured arm, hands gentle as they probed the cuts. Aran tried to convince his lungs to keep breathing, but there was something about Istve's touch that made his shoulders relax and his stomach tighten, and something catch in the back of his throat. At last, Istve let go of him and looked up with a small smile of relief, and again, Aran forced himself to look away. Looks like just surface cuts, but we should disinfect it. No point having your arms swell up like a damn balloon, like that time in the Spider Rim Basin. Aran chuckled despite himself. There was a questioning cheer-up from Istve's backpack, the fabric of it bulging and wriggling, and Aran's smile turned genuine. Hello there, Ani. Did you miss me? He reached over Istve's shoulder and unhooked the clasp on the backpack. The tip of a tentacle, striated with a bright, uneasy orange, emerged first, then another, and then Ani pulled her bulbous body delicately from the pack. She gave Istve a look that, even from her protuberant eyes, could only be called disdain, and tiptoed over Istve's shoulder until she could grasp Aran's hand with her tentacle suckers. Then she swarmed up his arm and settled herself firmly on his shoulder, grumbling to herself. Aran shook his head ruefully and reached up, stroking her. Hey there, sweetheart. I missed you too. Istve snorted. She spent the whole time trying to get me to turn around so we could go back and find you. They paused. On the bright side, there were about 6 jungle creatures that thought I looked like a tasty snack, and discovered they were no match for a land devil. So I'm grateful nonetheless. Ani had relaxed now, her grumbling turning to a slightly sulky purr. That's my good girl, Aran murmured, tickling her under the chin. Her tentacles changed slowly from irritated orange to a contented dark green, and Aran turned his attention back to Istve. Well, I guess we should go tell the others, he said reluctantly. Through the force field, he could make out people watching him, and their odd expressions made his stomach tighten with discomfort. Istve followed his gaze, then shook their head and chuckled, placing a hand on Aran's shoulder. You can't exactly blame them, they said, their tone fond and amused. I keep telling you this, but as much as you hate your heroic reputation, you do end up deserving it most of the time. Aran scowled at his friend, and Istve chuckled again and pulled him forward, holding up their wavelength so that the force field parted around the two of them as they stepped through. At least there weren't reporters. At least there was that, Aran thought to himself, trying hard to tamp down the irrational panic as the press of people crowded around him. Istvay stepped in front of him, smoothly pushing back the crowd. "He's got a scratch? Best to stand back. He needs to stay away from any possibility of infection until we can get it cleaned up." They managed to inject just the right blend of lightness and sincerity into their tone to make everyone back up a few paces. Ani, who'd been growling uneasily on Aran's shoulder, relaxed as the people made room, and Istvay shot Aran a wink over their shoulder. Aran's heart stuttered just a little as he followed them back towards where the tiny diplomatic corps, consisting of Chief Justice Alba, the mission's head diplomat and joint head of the Joias System government, Feliu, her clerk, Josip, the diplomatic aide, and Inez, the mission's linguist, had gathered. Alba looked up at their approach. Her face was strained, but she still wore the arrogant expression Aran had grown accustomed to. "Aran," she said briskly, "I suppose thanks are in order?" He blinked at her in surprise, then glanced over at Josip, who was sitting next to her. The older man's face was solemn, but his eyes twinkled, and Aran found himself grinning. "Alba," said Istvay. Their tone was short, and it would be a stretch to call it anything like respectful, but at least the hostility in it was more muted than usual, and again Aran glanced at Josip. He wasn't entirely sure how the man did it, but the tension seemed to diminish palpably whenever he was part of the conversation. Istvay gave a brief report of what they'd found, more or less what they'd already told Aran. When they'd finished, Alba nodded brusquely. "Our first priority must be getting these people to safety and getting assistance for the injured, which means, of necessity, ascertaining the aliens' attitudes towards us. I will go, of course, and I believe Josip and Inez must accompany me, as I will require their skills." She paused a moment. "I believe we will also need a guide, and the two of you are by far the most qualified. So, I would like to request that one of you come as well." There was a tone in her voice that said she didn't like having to ask the question and would much have preferred to have made an executive decision. Aran and Istvay glanced at each other. "I know what you're going to say, Aran, and the answer is no," said Istvay grimly. "The last time I left you alone without Ani, I came back to find you halfway inside the mouth of a jungle cat. Ani is staying with you." Aran scowled at them. "I'm not staying. I'm not the one who was poisoned. What, 4 days ago? You're right, Ani's staying, but you're damn well staying with her. I'm the only one who's been to the settlement. If one of us is going—" Istvay's face was set into the stubborn expression Aran knew far too well. He opened his mouth to cut Istvay off, but before he could, Josip held up a hand. "Pardon my interruption, but Aran, you and Istvay work well together. It seems a shame to separate you. And this morning we learned exactly how easy it is for this jungle to eat us, force field or no. Inez told me what happened out there." He gave a small, wry smile. "We're not safe here, not even with one of you two to protect us. I doubt at this point that there's a safe place to be had on this planet. It may be our best option to bring everyone along." He turned to the Chief Justice. "Madam, what are your thoughts?" Alba sighed, glancing over the assembled group of them. There were fewer than 200, said and done, from a ship of thousands, and Aran could see the strain of that knowledge in the lines of the woman's face. At last, though, she nodded. "I believe Josip is correct," she said, her tone softer than Aran remembered. "If there's no safe place, at the very least we should stick together." Istvay sighed, following Alba's gaze. Then, at last, they glanced over at Aran, and the corners of their mouth turned up a little in a rueful grin. "Well then, I guess we'd better get everyone ready to go." Chapter 2. Alba. Alba glanced over her shoulder at the small, ragged group behind her. The only ones left, out of a ship of thousands. In her 73 years of life, Alba had never imagined herself in a situation such as this one. There may be other survivors scattered around the planet, or others who still hadn't landed, but they had no way of knowing and no way of finding them. For all she knew, these were the only living humans in light years' distance. And after the portal had closed, breaking their ship to pieces, there was no chance of getting back without the assistance of whoever or whatever lived in this place. They'd reached the edge of the jungle without major incident, mostly thanks to the venomous murder beast purring on Iran's shoulder. Now, the landscape transitioned abruptly from thick trees to cleared fields, a flat, open area, maybe a kilometer or so, around the outside edge of the alien settlement. The city Istve had told them of. The city itself loomed ahead of them. She couldn't see it clearly through what seemed to be a massive, shimmering force field, glowing an icy blue and refracting the light from the planet's sun. But she caught a vague impression of towering buildings, oddly tall and narrow, and gleaming so brightly in the reflected light that the entire scene was a vague haze, almost painful to look at. She shivered. Diplomacy and peaceful negotiations were their best chance for survival. All the theorists back on Colorida had agreed. But the theorists weren't the ones leading this tiny remnant of survivors to what could be their death. "Madam, are you all right?" She glanced over. Josip had come up beside her, and his friendly eyes were crinkled in concern. She forced a small smile. "I'm perfectly well, thank you." Josip glanced back at the survivors, following her gaze. "I know," he said softly, "but at the moment, all we can do is our best to keep them, at least, alive." She took a long breath and nodded briskly. "You are correct." She raised her voice slightly. "Istve, would you be so kind as to lead the way? We'll come back for the others as soon as we're certain it's safe." Istve nodded, and she and her small, hand-picked party, Istve, Aran, Josip, and Inez, set off towards the city gate. Alba could feel the eyes of the others on their backs, following them. They'd made it barely halfway across the open area before they were spotted. A group of creatures, bipedal and uncomfortably humanoid, stepped onto the well-worn track the humans had been following and stopped abruptly, staring. Istve and Aran, in the lead, came to a halt as well. The creatures ahead of them were smaller than the humans, the tallest barely matched Alba in height, and wearing simple tunics that came to about their knees. Their bodies were covered with a fine fur, their eyes large, with darker fur patches around them that made them appear constantly surprised. They had thin, prehensile tails, long, delicate fingers, and small, rounded features, and they reminded Alba of nothing more than a larger version of the lemurs from the southern rim mountains back on Colorida. But there was something uncomfortably human in their expressions and movements, and an undefinable hint of threat in the wary way they watched the intruders. For a moment, the two groups stared at each other. With the aliens' diminutive size, their large eyes and delicate, perpetually surprised expressions, the overall effect should have made for something cute and harmless. But seeing them standing only a few meters away, Alba was struck by the sharp intelligence in those large eyes, the hint of canines peeking through their lips, how easily those long fingers would be able to grab and twist. The small group had drawn back protectively and was chattering in a language that was entirely unintelligible. One of them held something that was likely a weapon, and Alba was surprised by the obvious technological sophistication behind it. When they appeared to have finished speaking, Josip glanced at her, a question in the look. Alba hesitated, then nodded, ignoring the tight worry in the pit of her stomach. He stepped forward, hands spread in a non-threatening gesture, and the aliens drew back in alarm, watching him with obvious suspicion. "We're not here to hurt you," Josip said. They almost certainly wouldn't understand his words, but his tone was calm and soothing. "We were stranded, and we need help and medical assistance." He pointed to the sky, and pantomimed an object falling and impacting on the ground, and then drew back his sleeve to show the bandage on his arm, crusted with dried blood, and made an expression of pain. For a few moments, the aliens watched him. Then, at last, one of them gestured Josip back with a sharp, grunted command, pointing its weapon at the humans in a way that required no interpretation. It said something over its shoulder, and 3 or 4 of the aliens ran off, chattering excitedly among themselves. "Well, I guess that solves the problem of getting their attention, Istve muttered dryly. The heat hung over their small group like a heavy blanket, insects buzzing around their heads. Istve shifted their weight from foot to foot, and beside Alba, Inez clutched her religious icon, her eyes closed, and recited litanies under her breath. Then, at last, the alien watching them stiffened, its hand on its weapon tightening, and Alba looked up sharply. From the direction of the city, a grim-looking troop of aliens approached their ragged band, each of them carrying a large weapon. She drew in a deep breath. At this point, it was too late to change her mind. The aliens surrounded them, weapons held threateningly. The leader of the newcomers stepped forward, consulting quietly with the alien who'd stayed behind as guard. Then it turned to the group of humans, and it spoke loudly and slowly, pointing at them, the sky itself its weapon. When they simply stared, it shook its head in disgust and turned its weapon towards a small bush. It pulled the trigger, and the bush vaporized. There was no explosion. It was simply that one moment the bush was there, and the next it was not. Alba caught the glance that passed between Aran and Istve, the sharp worry in it. "What the hell?" Aran began quietly. The alien gestured to the weapon, the place where the bush had been, and back at the humans. Even without understanding the language, the threat was abundantly clear. Then it growled something at them. Alba glanced at Inez, but the girl shrugged helplessly. The alien tried again, clearly growing impatient, and gestured into the jungle. At last, it turned away in apparent exasperation, its tail puffed, and growled something to its subordinates. Alba couldn't read its expression, but its posture showed agitation. And then Aran swore, and she glanced over, following his gaze. Her stomach dropped. The rest of the survivors were being herded across the open ground towards them, surrounded by grim-looking aliens, their weapons trained on their human captives. When they reached the diplomatic party, Joska, the woman they'd left in charge, said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Chief Justice. I thought it better to go with them than be shot down." "You did exactly as you should have," said Josip, smiling, but Alba could see the tension under his smile. "At this point, we're all at their mercy in any case." The alien who seemed to be in charge barked another command. Two of its subordinates stepped forward, pulling half a dozen people from the edge of the group and arranging them in a line. "What are you—" Alba began, stepping forward, shocked out of her caution. One of the aliens grabbed her roughly, shoving her backwards. She stumbled, shocked at the unexpected violence, and Josip barely caught her before she could fall. The alien in charge grunted to its subordinates again, and to her horror, Alba saw them raise their weapons to point at the struggling human survivors. "No!" snapped Istve, stepping forward. "You're not doing this!" Aran stepped up beside Istve, planting himself between the aliens and their captives, his hands raised placatingly. "Listen," he began. "I'm sure we can—" One of the aliens grabbed for him, and Alba heard Istve's sharp intake of breath. Ani hissed, the pouches under her eyes puffing up, and her color changing to a bright orange. "Ani! No, it's fine, sweetheart. We're just meeting some new friends," Aran whispered frantically, stroking her tentacles. The alien stepped forward again in irritation, bringing up its weapon. Ani struck. Alba wasn't sure what else to call the whip-crack motion as the tentacle beast reared back and spat. "Ani!" Aran began, his voice horrified, and the alien melted. There wasn't even time for a scream. Its face simply dissolved into a bloody, gruesome mess, its weapon falling as the specks of bloody foam hit the ground, steaming. Aran was holding Ani with both hands, apparently trying to keep her from a full-scale rampage. Istve stood beside Aran, tensed to do something, although Alba wasn't certain what they'd be able to do in the face of an irate land devil and a group of heavily armed aliens. One of the aliens leapt forward, and Ani pulled free of Aran's grip, landing on the creature's face. The alien screamed, high-pitched and terrified. One of the other aliens yanked out its own weapon, turned it on its compatriot, and fired. Aran gave a wordless cry of distress, and Istve grabbed his arm, holding him back as the alien dissolved under the weapon fire. When the smoke cleared, Ani sat in the center of a small pile of debris. Her color had gone a wavering, psychedelic pink and green, but she seemed to have suffered no other ill effects. If a land devil could look smug, this one did. "Ani!" Aran gasped, his voice choking. "Ani! Come here, sweetheart, come, I'll find you a treat. No one's going to hurt us. At least, probably not anymore." He trailed off, but Ani made her delicate way across the ground and swarmed up his side, perching herself on his shoulder and growling in discontent, eye pouches bulging. Everyone else stood shocked and still, watching the bloody mess that was left of the one alien and the pile of debris that was left of the other. One of the aliens stepped forward quickly and grabbed the arm of the captain, whispering desperately in its ear and pointing back towards the jungle. If Alba recalled correctly, Ani had left something of a mess around the place they'd left the others, in the form of one of the massive jungle cats, which had tried to ambush their company. The alien in charge glanced reflexively at Aran and stepped quickly back. It gestured to its subordinates, and they lowered their weapons. At another command, they shoved their captives back towards the main group. Slowly, Ani's hissing died down as Aran and Istve stepped back to join the others. The aliens consulted for a few moments. At last, the captain stepped forward, cautiously, and gestured for them to follow. Josip hesitated, glancing at Alba. "I think it's best we go with them," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Aran?" "We should go," he muttered. He seemed to be making no attempt to hide the shakiness in his voice. "Maybe Ani can't be killed, but the rest of us damn well can." "Well, I think they'll have second thoughts about killing us outright now, at any rate," said Istve, their voice grim. "If they try to split us up, we'll deal with it then. But we're not going back to the jungle without a fight, if I'm any judge." Alba glanced around at the weary, ragged group of survivors. They wouldn't survive a fight. They could barely stay on their feet. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and started forward after their captors. She'd been the one to bring them here. And it was starting to look like a terrible, terrible mistake. Chapter 3. Savina. Savina tried to blend herself in with the other survivors as the alien guards prodded them through the break in the city force field. But as she stepped through and into the city properly, she had an uncanny flashback of stepping through the gates of the Corpus Dei compound as a young child, back in the Rim Mountains where she'd grown up. It wasn't a pleasant memory. She took a deep breath and looked around her, peering through the stifling press of terrified survivors to shake the strange feeling of déjà vu. The city they'd entered was as alien as their captors, but in one other way, it felt more like the compound than she liked to remember, the pervasive, cloying, sickening stench of fear. She shook her head at herself. It would be fine. She'd been in tight places before, and she'd always managed to charm or murder her way out. Yes, this was terrifying, but it was familiar. She knew how to survive. She was good at surviving, and she certainly could find a way to escape and then put a knife to the throat of whoever was in charge of opening the portal. She couldn't speak the alien's language, but she'd always found her knives spoke a dialect universally understood. She glanced reflexively over her shoulder to where Nicolau followed behind her, shoved along with the press of humans. He was gazing around him at the alien cityscape, and she could still see traces of tears on his cheeks. She'd heard his choked sobs the previous night, when they were all supposed to be asleep. She and Benny had saved his life when they dragged him off the diplomatic ship as it broke up. But they hadn't had time to save the lives of his friends, and he still had no idea why they'd done it, no idea he was their brother. As far as he knew, he was completely alone here. And behind him, the ship's captain Joska followed, her apparent nonchalance marred by the wry look on her face as she watched Savina. Savina hadn't told the woman she still intended to kill Alba, just as soon as the Chief Justice was no longer necessary for getting them home, but Joska must have guessed it. She was keeping an eye on Savina as if she were a farmer and Savina a hawk circling her precious chickens. Savina scowled. She'd hijacked the damn woman's ship and threatened to murder her more times than she could count. You'd think the bastard would be worried about her own life. Instead, Joska seemed intent on treating Savina like a troubled youth entrusted to her care. She turned away with a sigh and followed Nicolao's gaze around their new environment. The layout of the city was like nothing she'd ever seen in her life. The buildings thrust upwards into the sky with a height and solidity that belied the delicate, graceful curvature of their architecture. They looked like something fanciful, like something a doting Orthodox mother might spin from sugar for a child on their birthday. The height of them should have made the streets below almost a tunnel, but the buildings were constructed of glass and thin bands of metal, and the light from the sun shone through them, illuminating the streets in a sunburst of stripes and shadows. It was hard to believe the creatures who'd built them were the same creatures who, a short time before, had tried to shoot their human captives down in cold blood. The streets themselves weren't bustling with foot traffic like she was used to in the larger cities on Colorida. The inhabitants seemed to prefer to stay indoors. A network of tunnels spread between the buildings, connecting them in an elegant maze that sparkled in the diluted sun through the force field as if made of precious gems, and the skyways, where the transports buzzed back and forth, seemed to take up most of the streets themselves, the transports flying low to the ground and crowding out the space for pedestrians rather than high overhead as they did in Vila Nova do Sol. But, at the street level, it looked much more familiar. Dirty streets, narrow alleys, dirty-looking aliens peering from behind alley walls, faces pinched and hungry. It seemed that no matter how advanced these aliens were, they hadn't solved problems like children starving to death in the streets. Their captors shoved the group of humans down a wide street and into a large open space that looked like a transport hub. They herded their captives into the center and then stepped back, eyeing the hideous-looking tentacle beast on Iran Romo's shoulder suspiciously, their weapons held at the ready. Savina glanced at the creature and gave a small shudder. She'd watched the ease with which the thing had taken out the aliens, and, more unsettling still, its apparent complete immunity to the alien weaponry. She would simply have to make very sure that, in her attempts to kill Alba, she never got on the scientist's bad side. He seemed simple and almost painfully naive, but if half the stories she'd heard about him were true, he was more dangerous than he looked, even without taking his horrifying pet into account. Savina studied their captors carefully from the corner of her eye. They were small, lithe-looking creatures with delicate bone structures and fine features. Of course, when someone had a weapon that could vaporize you, it was almost irrelevant how physically strong they were. "Savina?" Benny spoke in a whisper from beside her, their voice small and frightened. "What are they like?" It had been a long time, Savina realized, since she'd heard Benny sound frightened. She turned back to Benny quickly, smiling. Benny might not be able to see, but they'd always been able to read Savina's expressions in her voice. "They're, I don't know, not as strange as I thought they'd be," she whispered. "They look almost human, but not, a little like the lemur monkeys in the mountains around the compound." Benny cracked a smile. "You're not giving me a very intimidating picture of them." Savina shivered slightly. "I don't have to." "That weapon they fired?" Benny's voice was serious now. "I heard it, and I got my wavelength sensor to send me through the specs. We don't have anything back on Colorida that could stand up to a weapon like that." "I know," said Savina grimly. Overhead, a small aircraft was approaching. It was large and flat, with sleek, smooth sides, and it made almost no noise as it came to a hovering halt over them. Their alien captors chattered at the humans, gesturing them out of the way to make room for it to land, and Savina and Benny were shoved backwards until Savina's back was practically pressed against the wall of one of the buildings. She glanced around quickly and let out a quick breath of relief. Benny had ended up beside her in the crush, up against the corner of an alley, and Nicolao was standing close by. She tried to ignore how her eyes flicked over to find Joska and Rafael. She didn't need to be worrying about those two. They'd be fine. But she couldn't help the flicker of relief in her chest when she saw that they too were close by and unharmed. And then, from the corner of her eye, she caught a quick flash of movement, heard a startled exclamation, quickly cut off. She spun in time to see Nicolau, face blank with shock, being dragged into the alley behind her. Savina swore through her teeth and dived into the alley after him. "Savina, what's wrong?" Benny's voice followed her, but she didn't have time to answer. The alley was empty, but Savina caught another flash of movement disappearing around a corner. She yanked out her pulse pistol and started after them at a run. She rounded the corner in time to see an alien dragging Nicolau back towards a group of 2 others. Nicolau's captor looked up as Savina rounded the corner, alarm on its face, and jerked Nicolau around in front of it. It was holding a weapon, the same type she'd seen earlier, to Nicolau's head. Another alien had its own weapon drawn, pointing at Savina. Nicolau's eyes were wide with shock, and for a moment, Savina's vision went red. No one was going to hurt her baby brother. She took a deep breath, fighting back the quick surge of rage. She'd have to work this carefully if she wanted to keep him alive. But then, she was good at this sort of thing. She stopped where she was, widening her eyes as if in fear. She bent carefully, laying her pulse pistol on the ground, and held out her hands in front of her to show they were empty. She didn't know anything about these aliens, their body language or their culture or their weapons, but she could see the moment where the tension in the posture of the one holding Nicolau began to relax. And as it did, Savina took a small step forward and, in a smooth motion, yanked 3 throwing knives from her belt. 2 of them went through the throat of Nicolau's captor, and blood sprayed across Nicolau's face as the creature dropped to the ground, choking. The 3rd went through the shoulder of the alien who'd been pointing its weapon at Savina, piercing its flesh and lodging deep in the wall behind it. Before the alien could react, Savina was across the alley to it, an electric trank in her hand. She slapped it against the injured alien's shoulder, and the creature froze as the current jolted through it. Savina grabbed Nicolau by the arm and shoved him behind her, turning to the 3rd alien. The alien grabbed for its weapon, but before it could bring it to bear, Savina grabbed the front of the creature's tunic and yanked it forward, off its feet. She slammed it against the wall, and it yelped in pain, but the sound was cut off as Savina yanked out another electric trank and slapped against the side of the creature's neck. It froze, immobilized, and Savina let go, letting it fall to the ground as she stepped back. Then she bent over its prone body, her eyes hard and cold. "Maybe you don't understand a word I'm saying," she purred, menace dripping from her tone, "but know this. Nicolau is mine, and you are going to stay away from him." Nicolau was standing where she'd left him, as frozen as if she'd used an electric trank on him, too. Savina pulled 3 more knives from her belt. She smiled, letting her dimple show. "And you will stay the hell away from me," she whispered. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the needle-sharp knife through the alien's shoulder, feeling the muscles and tendons separate under the smooth edge of her blade. The alien's eyes were wide with pain and shock, but it couldn't move, couldn't even make a sound. She shoved the blade the rest of the way through, jamming the point into the rough cement of the street below, and let her smile widen, just a little. Then she took the 2nd knife and worked it, just as slowly, through the creature's other shoulder. She might not always be here to protect Nicolau. May as well give these aliens a lesson they wouldn't forget. From behind her, Nicolau made a sound like he was going to be sick. The alien was still staring at her, frozen and horrified, eyes brimming with pain. She pulled out her 3rd knife and very gently traced it across the alien's throat. A thin line of red blossomed up in its wake. "I'm not joking," she said, her voice pleasant and low. "I'm not playing around, and I can make you hurt in ways you can't even imagine." She dimpled prettily. "Maybe you don't understand my words, but I hope I've made my meaning clear anyway." She stood, wiping her bloody hands clean on the alien's tunic. It didn't take its eyes off her the whole time, the tendons in its neck tight, and the whites visible all the way around its eyes. When she turned around, Benny had reached Nicolau, grabbing him by the shoulders, feeling down his arms, checking for injuries. "Are you all right?" they asked, breathing hard. Nicolau didn't answer, just stared past Benny at Savina, as though he was staring into the void itself, his face deathly pale beneath his brown complexion. Savina gave him her most charming smile. It wasn't a bad thing for her baby brother to learn some respect. There was a noise from behind her, and Savina spun in time to see the alien she'd pinned to the wall with a knife double forward. It must have knocked the electric trank loose somehow, because it caught its balance and stumbled off at a run, clutching its bleeding shoulder. Savina swore and sent a knife after it, but it clattered off the wall of a building as the creature disappeared around a corner. Savina narrowed her eyes and shook her head in disgust. It probably wasn't worth going after, not in a city where she didn't know the unspoken rules or speak the language. Besides, the point of all that was so that one of the creatures would pass on the message to its little friends that Nicolau was off limits. That was efficient. Horrifying, but efficient, said a dry, amused voice, and Savina turned back, cursing. Had the entire damn crew followed her here? Joska stood at the entrance to the alley, arms crossed on her chest, one eyebrow quirked. Raphael stood beside her, glowering. I'm starting to think Raphael and I are unbelievably lucky to still be alive, honestly, Joska said. Savina glared at her. Stay out of this! It's none of your damn business! Joska raised her eyebrow higher. I think it is, at least until we get off this planet and back through the portal. Her voice had grown, if possible, even more dry. I'd hate to see anything happen to my two favorite thieves and murderers before you give me my ship back. Nicolau was looking back and forth between Savina, Joska, and the fallen aliens, his expression a combination of terror, nausea, and utter bafflement. Look, he said finally, swallowing hard and turning to Savina. I'm very grateful to you for saving my life, but shouldn't we... He gestured back up the alley. Savina rolled her eyes. Yes, she snapped, glaring at Joska. We should all get back to the others, considering the good captain here seems very uncomfortable leaving us alone. She strode over, grabbed Nicola's arm, and started hauling him back down the alley the way they'd come. Benny fell into step with them. Are you hurt, Vina? They asked in a small whisper. Is Nicolau hurt? No, said Savina brusquely. Everyone's fine. Except for the aliens, Benny said. Except for them. Savina allowed herself a small smile. Nicolau was glancing between her and Benny as if he was now unsure which of them he should fear more. They rounded a corner of the alley that led to the main street. The last of the stragglers were being herded into the transport, and Savina hesitated a moment. Still, probably safer to be in the group for now, at least until they figured out what the aliens wanted. It wasn't like she had any desire to go back into that nightmare of a jungle. We should be able to slip back in without them noticing, she began, speaking just loudly enough for Joska and Raphael behind her to hear. Then she stopped short, icy fingers tightening around her chest. Across the open area where the human survivors were huddled, she caught the faintest flicker of movement in the shadows of an alley. It was barely visible, unless you were watching for it, but Savina had been born watching, and now her entire body went ice cold. She recognized that odd gray color that her eyes wanted to skip over, the lean, elegant form. And she didn't need to see the figure's face to picture the hatred in those icy slate hazel eyes or the thin, dangerous knife edge of a smile. Reka Solar, the government agent who'd been pursuing her, armed with a government warrant, who'd followed her through the damn portal. Savina stepped backwards quickly, pulling Nicolau and Benny after her out of sight behind the walls. How the hell had Reka followed her here? Reka was supposed to have died on the diplomatic ship when it broke up. Her breath was coming oddly quickly, her hands trembling. Savina, what's wrong? There was concern in Joska's voice. Savina closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she turned, she was somehow able to keep her voice steady. The government agent, she said in a flat tone. She's followed us. Emotions flickered over Joska's face. Fear, concern, worry. but her expression settled, finally, into that familiar, slightly ironic resignation. "Well," she said at last, "you can't say she doesn't take her job seriously." Raphael was scowling, his expression even more irritated than was its wont. "Don't expect sympathy from me," he grumbled. Savina shot him an icy glare. "Believe me," she hissed, "I don't need sympathy from a useless one-legged man with a paunch." He stared at her for a moment, his expression odd, and there was something under the irritation, something that could have been hurt. "Savina," said Joska, her voice sharp, "you and I are going to have a talk very soon." Savina had seen Joska upset before, but now there was a cold anger in her face that made Savina swallow, and she stared at the captain a moment longer, almost as shaken by her sudden anger as she had been by the sight of Reka. Joska took a long breath, visibly restraining her temper, and Nicolau cleared his throat. I hate to interrupt, but could someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" As one, they all turned to glare at him. He looked faintly uncomfortable, but there was a stubborn expression on his face that told Savina her baby brother had no intention of just shutting up and going along. "I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful to you for saving my life back on the ship, and then coming after me when that alien grabbed me, but—" Savina grabbed him by the shoulders, even though he was significantly taller than she was, and turned him to face her. "There is a government agent after me," she said in an icy undertone. "She followed me here, and she's going to try to kill me. I assume she'll try to kill everyone with me as well, which includes you. So if you like being alive, I suggest you shut the hell up and do as you're told." She grabbed Benny and her brother by the arms and shoved them farther back into the narrow, dirty back alleys of the alien city, well out of sight of the rest of the group. She wasn't sure if she was irritated or relieved to hear Joska's and Raphael's footsteps following. "What's the plan, Savina?" the captain asked in her low, calm tone, when at last they came to a halt. "We're not in the Joias System anymore. There's nowhere to run, not if we plan to ever make it back." Savina glared at her, hoping the irritation in her voice would hide the shakiness. "No one asked you to follow me," she snapped. Joska raised an eyebrow again. "As I recall, someone stole my ship and put me into the crosshairs of that very government agent. I think I have as much vested interest in this as you do at this point." Savina scowled harder, fighting down the twinge of guilt. "All right, what do you suggest?" Joska sighed. "You're not going to want to hear this, but I think our best bet is to talk to Alba. We're behind the portal, trapped in a city full of aliens. Perhaps she won't be impressed by your previous activities, but I sincerely doubt she'll be overly worried about punishing you as things stand. She's the one who issued the warrant against you, and she can put it in abeyance until the issue of the aliens is settled." Savina stared at the woman, struck speechless for a moment. "You think I should turn myself into Alba Espina, the Chief Justice?" she said when she'd regained her power of speech. "You honestly think she won't just have me killed where I stand? And what about Benny and Nicolau and you and Raphael? She'll figure out pretty quickly that you're with me." Joska shook her head. "I'm not saying it's ideal, but from what I hear, Alba has a sense of fairness, at the very least. You've saved several of the ship's crew when you pulled them off the diplomatic ship, and you helped protect the others in the jungle. She may be willing to let bygones be bygones, or at the very least, commute your sentence somewhat when we get back." Savina was still staring, her heart beat far too quickly. Alba Espina, the judge of heresies, the woman who had haunted her nightmares since she was a child, the woman she'd sworn to kill. Savina. Joska leaned forward just a little and laid a hand on Savina's arm. There was a sympathy in her eyes that almost made Savina sick. "I don't know what got you to where you are," she said quietly. "But the world isn't quite as desperate a place as you seem to believe it is." Savina took a deep breath, narrowing her eyes. For Joska, and for people like her, the world wasn't as desperate a place, perhaps. Joska was orthodox. She was a ship's captain of a ship she owned herself, Or had, until she'd met Savina. She was the type of person the system was built for. She had no idea what desperation meant. She had no idea how it felt to spend your childhood terrified, so afraid you could hardly breathe, knowing that any moment the world could come crashing down on you, that if you were ever found, you'd be killed, that if anyone knew who you were, you'd be killed, that there was no one, anywhere, who'd protect you. She reached up and grabbed Joska's wrist, wrenching the woman's hand off her jacket. "If you plan on talking to Alba," she said through clenched teeth, "you'll have to kill me first." Rafael gave her a disgusted look that said, as clear as words, that if that happened, he wouldn't regret it. And then Benny said quietly, "Savina?" There was a tone in their voice that made Savina look up. Benny's face was taut, their body tense, and they wore the look of concentration they always had when they were interpreting an unfamiliar reading from their wavelength's echolocator. And even before Savina turned, she knew, with a heavy dread that sat in the pit of her stomach, what she'd see. She turned anyway. She and the others were standing in the intersection of two alleys, and now 3 of the alley entrances were filled with the strange, monkey-like aliens. Each of them carried one of their deadly weapons, and every weapon was pointed at Savina and her companions. And at the very front of the group, lips pulled back from their teeth in a menacing snarl, shirt stained and dripping with blood, stood the alien that, only a few minutes before, Savina had pinned to the wall with her knife. Chapter 4. Alba. By the time the transport reached their apparent destination, a massive cluster of buildings in the center of the city, Alba's entire body ached. There had been no comfortable seats, and the survivors were practically piled on top of each other. Inez and Josip had done their best to make room for her. Istve seemed mostly focused on keeping Aran from an actual panic attack in the crowded space, with inconclusive results. But her body, already battered and bruised from the escape from the dying ship and then the night in the jungle, felt as she'd imagined a stick fighter would feel after a particularly bruising competition bout. She didn't dare look back to see how Felu and the rest of the injured were doing. There was nothing she could do about it now, and besides, she wasn't certain she could stand to see the pallor of her old clerk's face and the pain in his eyes. She was here to keep them safe. She was a diplomat and a politician, and everything she'd told the council back on Colorida, when she'd proposed this mission, was still true. Better to meet these aliens with an offer of peace and friendship than a threat. She was still the person best positioned to find a way to keep these survivors alive. She'd been the reason, or at least part of the reason, so many had died, a tiny voice in the back of her head reminded her. She had to save these survivors, at least. She had to be able to do at least that. And she refused to let herself think about how desperate a litany that thought had become. When the transport finally came to a halt, Alba pushed herself painfully to her feet. She had to lean on Inez for a few steps before her aching legs condescended to hold her up. And then she stepped down the ramp and out into the alien city, blinking at the light after the dimness from inside the windowless transport. She'd grown up in Villa Nova do Sol, back on Colorida. She'd grown used to the ancient, beautiful stone buildings, the cobblestone streets, the charcoal fires at the corners of alleys, where people huddled for warmth in the damp winters or cooked their food in the sultry summer heat. The very age and history of it had sunk into her bones, and she'd always felt the city was a part of her as much as she was a part of it, the minerals in her bones, the ones leached off the ancient buildings into the watershed in the heavy spring rains. This city, though, was something entirely new. They'd been brought to a long, massive cement courtyard, surrounded by low-roofed buildings and broad streets and lined with towering jungle trees, carefully pruned. The broad main walkway was arched over with a thin, transparent plex, and ended in a large, shallow set of stairs leading up to a massive cluster of buildings. The buildings were a work of art in and of themselves, towering sponge sugar confections of things, all glass and soaring arches and dizzying height. The metal struts that gave them strength were barely noticeable by a trick of the architecture and the way the light refracted from the glass, so the structures looked to be made of sunlight and air. At street height, the building walls were a latticework of glass and steel, just enough to keep the interior of the building from being visible, but offering tantalizing glimpses of color and light from within. Alba had expected a focused, intense heat under the plex of the courtyard, like the inside of a greenhouse, but something about the way the material fractured and reflected light must have negated the greenhouse effect, because it was no warmer here than it had been in the jungle, and a cool, likely artificial breeze, carrying with it a thick, heady scent of flowers, wafted gently through her sweaty hair. The faces of the others were drawn with terror or shock as they stumbled from the transport after her, their filthily blood-stained clothing and exhausted expressions a sharp contrast to the clean, elegant lines in every aspect of the alien city. They stood in a huddled mass until one of the alien guards beckoned them roughly forward. No one seemed willing to move, so Alba straightened painfully and stepped out ahead. Her heart was pounding strangely. For all she knew, these aliens were taking them somewhere to kill them, shoot them with their odd, terrifying weapons, or eat their flesh as a delicacy. Every frightening tale parents told their children back on Colorita to frighten them into good behavior rose nebulously from her memory, like silt stirred up from the bottom of a pond. It was all nonsense, of course. These creatures, as Istve had said, were clearly sapient. They had a functional language and an obvious ability to collaborate in order to accomplish tasks as a group. And furthermore, their degree of technological advancement equaled or exceeded that of the Joias System. A peaceful communication, a mutual learning of each other's culture, was not only possible, but likely. Still, the 6-year-old version of her, shivering in bed after a nighttime story, refused to be convinced. The alien in the lead gestured impatiently across the courtyard to the large stone steps, and Alba tried not to let a limp show in her walk as she strode forward. Inez jumped after her, sticking to her side like a shadow, and Josip stepped forward as well. His face was grave, but there was that familiar twinkle of good humor in his eyes, and the sight was unaccountably reassuring. The others hesitated, but followed at last, taking their cues from her. She looked around surreptitiously as she made her slow, painful way down the cement walkway. The trees lining the courtyard were large, with gnarled branches spreading a lacework of shade across the bare cement. Unfamiliar, brightly colored insects and birds fluttered through the air, their songs alien, but the sound vaguely comforting. When they reached the long, low stairs, the guards brought them to a halt and stopped to confer among themselves in low voices. Even with the thin, lacy shade from the trees, the sun reflected against the glass of the buildings and glowed through the city force field, turning the air into a heavy, wet blanket. Sweat dripped, sticky and damp, down the back of Alba's neck and itched uncomfortably in her hair. The droning chirp of insects was monotonous, and overhead she could see the progress of the planet's sun already dipping towards the horizon. At last, an alien emerged from the building in front of them, the glass seeming to melt open for it to step through, then reform behind it. It crossed quickly to the guards and said something sharp. The guards responded respectfully, gesturing at the group of humans, while speaking quietly in their chattering language, and at last the newcomer turned to the group. The creature's eyes roved over the group, and then, after a moment of consideration, it gestured Alba forward. She took a deep breath, raised her chin, and stepped out alone from the crowd. There was something vulnerable and almost naked about standing alone in front of those odd, intense, alien gazes, all of them fixed on her. The newcomer gave a peremptory gesture for her to follow. Istve made a sound of protest, and from the corner of her eye she could see Iran step forward as well. The aliens jumped back at his approach, raising their weapons. "No!" Alba snapped. She took a deep breath. "No. Please wait here. I believe it's best to see what they want." "If I may, madam," said Josip quietly from behind her, "it would be prudent to have others accompanying you." Alba turned, and so did her guide. Josip turned to the alien and gestured to Alba, then to himself, then pointed to one or two others. The alien watched him in confusion for a moment, and he tried again, stepping forward and miming following Alba. Alba's heart was still pounding strangely fast, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She should protest, probably. They could be merely taking her away to kill her, and, in that case, best they take her alone. But Josip was right. Having more people along increased the chances that someone would be left alive to tell the others what had happened. And, she reminded herself, in the more likely case that this was a simple introduction, having more people along would increase the likelihood that they could accomplish their primary objective of, at the very minimum, conveying to their hosts, or captors, their party's urgent need of medical supplies and food and water. But she couldn't ignore the sick, guilty flood of relief at the thought of not having to step into that Wondertale building alone. She'd read far too many stories, as a child, of what happened in Wondertales to the lone child lured into a building of sunlight and spun sugar. At last, the alien gave a grunt of what appeared to be acquiescence. "I'll come, of course, madam," said Josip in a low voice. "And who else?" You brought me here to help with the language," said Inez in a small voice. I should probably come too." "I'm coming," said Istvay bluntly. "None of you are scientists, and you might need me." "Pishti," Aran began, starting forward after Istvay. Immediately, their guards jumped back again, their faces taking on an expression of what could only be called terror, as they chattered over their shoulders to the newcomer. Ani, still perched on Aran's shoulder, was growling softly. Perhaps, Alba thought wryly, the uniting characteristic that bound all sapient life forms in the universe was, in the end, being afraid of Ani. The other guards raised their weapons, pointing them at the remainder of the survivors, and Aran hesitated. "You stay here, Aran," said Istvay quietly. "I'll go. Ani's never going to let you leave her here without you, and the aliens aren't going to let her anywhere near them, not if they're smart. Besides, we don't want them to change their minds and vaporize the rest of the group while we're gone." Istvay's face was grim, but they didn't appear particularly frightened, at least not of the aliens. Aran looked more than a little unhappy, but Alba didn't give him time to protest. "Istvay is right," she said briskly. "Someone needs to stay here and protect the others, and you're best positioned to do so as long as you have that nightmare beast on your shoulder." Istvay shot her a look that was almost gratitude, then turned back to Aran. "I'll be fine, I promise," they said in a low voice. "If they'd wanted to kill us, there are 100 ways they could have already." Then Istvay stepped up to join the tiny diplomatic party. "If you're not back by nightfall, I'm damn well coming in after you," said Aran, his jaw set. Istvay glanced around at the alien guards. "I'm not going to argue with that," they muttered. Alba couldn't help a quick glance backwards at Felyu as she turned to follow her alien guide. He'd be furious she was going without him, if he was in any state to know about it. He likely wasn't. His eyes were closed, his face drawn, and he looked either asleep or unconscious. He'd be of no use to anyone, including himself, unless she was able to somehow convey their desperate need for medical care, food, water, and shelter. Their alien guide looked at the four of them skeptically, but at last made a small motion that could have been a shrug and gestured again for them to follow. 2 other guards fell in behind Alba, and the other 3, their weapons held ready. Alba forced the tension from her posture. She'd been in politics long enough to know how dangerous it was to show fear, no matter how much fear you might feel. They followed their guide to the blank glass of the building. The creature rubbed the pad of a finger along the surface, and the glass seemed to dissolve, opening up an entrance a little wider than a doorway back on Colorida. Alba stepped through after the alien, despite visions of the glass reforming through the center of her body. It didn't, but somehow that fact didn't calm her nerves as much as it might have. The inside of the building they'd entered was a massive open space with hallways leading off to each side. The ceiling was of that strange, refracting, glass-like material that let through light and glimpses of movement from the upper stories of the building, but no clear sight. She had to bite back a quick, absurd snort of laughter At the thought that if the glass did give you a clear view, it would necessitate either a different uniform than the loose tunics for the aliens walking on the floors above them, or an entirely more intimate view of the alien civilization than she'd really wished for. The wide, airy hallways stretching out from the main floor of the building seemed almost more passageways than interior hallways, connecting the buildings together seamlessly like tunnels in an anthill. They don't seem to like the idea of being out under the sky, do they? Istve whispered from behind her. Between the tunnels and the force field and the canopy over the courtyard, it seems like they're avoiding it as hard as they can. Their alien guide brought them to a circular patch of floor in one corner that seemed to be made of a mosaic of glass tiles. And when they'd all stepped onto it, their guide licked its finger and made a complicated gesture in the air. The air surrounding the mosaic turned to a solid tube, closing them in, and Alba's stomach dropped as they shot upwards. Despite the fact that the feeling under her feet was almost of something solid, their pace was rapid, and the floors of the building around them flashed by. At last, however, they slowed, and at another gesture from their guide, another mosaic floor formed under their feet at what appeared to be floor level several stories farther up, and the transparent tube around them melted away. Their guide gestured them forward, and again they followed. "Ines," said Alba in a low voice, "do you have any sense at all as to what they're saying?" Inez shook her head mutely, her eyes wide. If I could even get a few words to reference, I could find something maybe, but... She trailed off. The hallways through which they were being led made Alba almost dizzy with vertigo. She wasn't one to be afraid of heights, but here, where the walls, ceiling, and floor were translucent as glass, it was difficult not to feel that you'd been pushed off a slide and were in that breathless, heart-stopping instant before your body realized what had happened and your stomach dropped with the fall. The alien leading them came to a halt and again traced a pattern on the glass. It dissolved, and the aliens stepped through, beckoning Alba and her small retinue after them. The inside of the room was as unfamiliar as everything else on this planet. Translucent walls and floor, cushions rested upon delicate stepped tiers that wound their way around the back of the room and up towards the ceiling. Other aliens, the fineness of their dress leading Alba to believe that they were even more important than a group that had led her here, sat comfortably on the tiers, watching her small company as they stumbled inside. The guards gestured the humans to a handful of stools, squat but covered with cushions that looked luxuriantly soft after the 2 days of nothing but the damp jungle floor. Alba hesitated a moment, then took her seat, and Josip and the others followed suit. For a few long moments, the humans and the aliens studied each other. Alba couldn't tell the aliens' ages. Even if she'd been able to, she had no idea what would be considered old on this planet. But the creatures seated in front of her had a certain dignity to their bearing that seemed to denote a high social rank. Their tunics were fine and gauzy and covered in delicate embroidery, and Alba was acutely aware of her own filthy, stained travel clothing, the tangles in her hair and the dirt and grime caked on her skin. At length, another alien came in, bearing a platter of what looked like fruits of some sort. They stopped in front of Alba and hung the tray on a hook cleverly concealed on the wall. The alien seated on the highest stool in front of them made a low, humming sound watching them and gestured to the platter, then mimed putting food in its mouth. "Istve?" asked Alba after a moment of hesitation. Istve took a fruit carefully and sniffed it. They broke the skin with their finger, licked it, frowning, and gave a small shrug. "I don't have the equipment with me to test it, but it's not bitter, and it looks like it's the same thing they're eating. Based on their physiology, I'd be willing to risk it." The alien gestured again impatiently, then pulled a fruit off its own platter and bit into it. "I suppose it's eat or starve at this point," said Josip, "and my stomach is informing me it would prefer to eat." He turned to Alba. "With your permission, madam?" She nodded, and he took one of the fruits off the platter, and following the example of the alien, pulled back the skin and bit into it. A sharp, sour, tangy, sweet smell burst in her nostrils at the small spray of juice, and Alba found her own stomach growling painfully. Josip chewed and swallowed, then turned back to them with a small grin. "At the very least, it doesn't seem to cause immediate death," he said, that ever-present twinkle of humor in his voice. Alba hesitated again for a moment, then took a fruit as well, and Inez followed suit. The fruit was as delicious as it smelled, cool and tangy and sweet, and by the time she'd finished, Alba found she wasn't quite as shaky as she had been. The aliens on the other side of the room watched them as they ate, talking and gesticulating amongst themselves at the party of humans as if they were inanimate objects being haggled over. And then a doorway appeared in the back of the room, the glass melting away, and everyone fell silent. Another group of the white-clad aliens stepped inside, their heads downcast, their movements almost subservient. They were followed by a smaller alien, its clothes so pale they appeared almost to glow. Its movements were slow and careful, and its face was creased with deep wrinkles. The servants stepped back, and the alien approached their party, steps slow and deliberate. It paused in front of Alba, studying her carefully, and again, she was painfully aware of her filthy, desperate state. The alien widened its eyes in the gesture that seemed to serve as a greeting. After a moment's hesitation, Alba did the same. The alien made a soft humming noise. And then it opened its mouth and, in slow, careful tones, said, "Welcome, humans. We would very much like to know why you have come." For a moment, Alba couldn't believe her own ears. She glanced at the others, who looked as flabbergasted as she did. Then she turned back to the alien. The words it had used were an older form of common dialect, mostly recognizable from ancient texts and classic literature, the unofficial common tongue that, stories had it, had been passed down from the language understood at one time by all the inhabitants of the generation ships. They still used it now and again in their periodic broadcasts to their sister ships' colonies, messages that would take up to a decade to be received and then another to be answered. As a politician, she knew the dialect well. What she didn't know was how the aliens knew it. Chapter 5. Aran. Aran stood abruptly, unable to force himself to sit even 1 second longer. Damn Istvay to hell. They knew damn well going into an unknown alien edifice with Alba could get them killed. They just didn't care. They were set on finding a way to open the portal again, Aran and his opinions be damned. One of the guards shifted uneasily at his sudden movement, and Ani's growls increased in volume, her bulbous eyes fixed on the alien. The alien stepped back quickly, its expression stiff with fear. Aran sighed heavily and reached up, rubbing Ani's head. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, trying to reassure himself as much as her. "Istvay'll be fine. They won't do anything stupid." At least he hoped they wouldn't. 3 weeks ago, he would have been confident in his assessment. Istvay wasn't like him, liable to get so caught up in what they were doing that they forgot practical considerations. Istvay was the steady one, the solid one, the one who remembered things like packing food and how much water they'd need for a 3-day expedition, but he drew in a long breath and stroked Ani's tentacles, her tight, nervous grip on him relaxing a little at his touch. He'd never seen Istvay like they'd been since the two of them had started this mission. He'd never imagined Istvay standing in their cabin, eyes closed, fists clenched, clearly on the verge of breaking down completely. Istvay was falling apart, and Aran had no idea what that even meant, or how to deal with things if Istvay wasn't the patient, stoic, practical one. He wasn't sure he had it in him to be that person if Istvay lost it. He took a deep breath and forced himself to kneel next to the unconscious Filiu. The man was laid prone on the hard concrete, along with the other badly injured members of their group, their heads pillowed on jackets donated by the other survivors. The old clerk looked terrible, his face wan, his breathing shallow. He'd been doing much better that morning, but the combination of the heat and the lack of shelter seemed to have whittled down his strength to nearly nothing. Aran pressed his fingers to the side of Filiu's throat, the injured man's pulse thrumming weak and rapid under his hand. Beside him, one of the crew members looked up, exhaustion on her face. "He's not going to last much longer, not if we don't get help," she said quietly. "Nor will the others." Aran nodded. I'll try again to get us some supplies. None of the injured are going to last much longer like this. The woman watched him with dull, pleading eyes, and he rose wearily to his feet. The guards stepped quickly back as he approached, raising their weapons with expressions of something like panic. He frowned, then realized they were staring at Ani, who'd puffed herself up and was starting to hiss menacingly. He sighed and held out his arm, and reluctantly Ani slithered down to envelop his forearm, the bags under her eyes puffed out angrily. The guards took another step back, and Aran shook his head. She's perfectly tame. She won't hurt you, not unless you provoke her. He reached out, keeping his movements slow and careful, and stroked Ani's head, then lifted her up to his face, rubbing his cheek against her warm, bulbous body to demonstrate how harmless she was. The guards still had their weapons drawn, but now they were staring at him instead of Ani, as if they thought he might be insane. She's tame, see? She's very friendly, he tried, tickling her under the chin. She growled, tightening her tentacles around his arm, and he said sharply, Ani, cut it out! She was still hissing, but reluctantly she loosened her grip. He shook his head at her in disapproval, and she slunk sulkily back up his arm and onto his shoulder. The guards were looking at Aran as though he'd become more terrifying than his pet. He sighed again and gestured to the huddled groups of humans. We need water, he said slowly. He spoke the same way he'd speak to an unpredictable animal out in the field. It wasn't the words so much as the tone of voice, calm and unthreatening. Water, he repeated, then mimed drinking from a bottle. The aliens were staring at him, but they whispered back and forth, pointing at Ani in obvious fear. At last, one of them stepped away, returning a few moments later with a soft jug. It placed it on the ground and backed away carefully, its eyes fixed on Ani. Aran shook his head in resignation, but stepped forward to retrieve the jug. Among so many, the jug of water was emptied quickly, but when Aran returned and placed the empty container on the ground, the aliens replaced it with a full one with impressive alacrity. Whatever they'd decided he'd do to them if they didn't cooperate seemed to be a potent threat. Every time there was a movement from the direction of the buildings, he found himself jerking his head up, his gaze pulled unconsciously to where Istve and the others had disappeared. After about the 17th time, he shook his head and pushed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He was being ridiculous. Istve was fine. He couldn't seem to convince his nerves of it, though. Finally, he stood and paced restlessly along the base of the stairs. The open courtyard they'd been brought through must be some sort of public square or park, because the area had grown crowded with pedestrians. The aliens stayed a respectful distance back from the guards, but they were clearly curious, watching the strangers with their large, wide eyes. He didn't realize how tense he was until he felt Ani's tentacles tightening along his shoulders in response. Ani, he said warningly, and she loosened her grip with reluctance. She was just as nervous as he was. Then he frowned, cocking his head to the side. In the courtyard, a small group of alien children were playing a sort of clapping game, and the song they were chanting was hauntingly familiar. He listened closer, frowning. It was almost exactly the same as a song he and Istve and their small, ragged handful of friends had sung in the streets back in Colorida when they were kids. He had to be imagining things. He glanced back at their alien guards, feeling suddenly very cold. 2 different cultures, from 2 entirely separate galaxies, and there was no way that their children would know the same tune by coincidence. And as he listened more closely, he could pick out words, garbled, almost unintelligible unless you knew what to listen for, but words nonetheless, in the old form of common dialect, the one they used to share scientific discoveries between the colony ships. River rock, cold as stone, where's the place you call your home? Charcoal brick, hot as fire, who's the one that you desire? If you're sweet, you get a kiss. If you're not, you end like this. Turn around, touch the ground, we will kick you out of town. His breath was coming too fast, and he recognized it absently. He was either afraid or excited. His endocrine system didn't differentiate. He could vaguely make out, through the crowd, the circle of children singing and clapping. Alien children, from an alien planet, singing the same words he and Istvay had sung years ago and light years away. And then one of the children jumped up, and the song broke off as they ran. The child in the center grabbed the small ball used to tag the others out and threw it after the fleeing child. It hit a tree limb, bounced, and soared up into the air, landing in the courtyard next to Aran. Aran bent to retrieve it automatically, and then almost dropped it again in cold shock. There was a mark on it, a manufacturer's mark, just like the marks on the toys and books used by the children through Colorida. The mark wasn't familiar, but the lettering underneath was. He'd seen that name not long ago, the last time he and Istvay had come back to Del Sol to purchase supplies for their trip to the Outer Rim volcano. Labyrinto. The name of one of the colonies from a sister generation ship. The colony they hadn't heard from in decades. No one knew what had happened to it or why the people there weren't answering. The hope had been that it was simply a matter of malfunctioning equipment. But he'd seen on the faces of the other scientists that, despite their optimistic words, they feared it was something much worse. Who knew, really, what lurked in the outer reaches of space? His hands were shaking slightly. He slipped the ball into his supplies pouch and reached up to rub Ani's head. "It's going to be all right," he whispered. "Everything's going to be all right." But this time, he didn't even try to pretend it was Ani he was trying to reassure. The brilliant orange-red streaks of sunset had flared upwards against the deepening blue of the sky when a small group of aliens dressed in white shifts with embroidered hints of delicate, subtle blues and greens stepped out of the building where Alba and Istvay and the others had disappeared. Aran jumped up from where he'd been seated near Feliu, and Ani, who'd settled into a dejected lump on his shoulder, perked up with a low, growling hiss. The newcomers conversed quickly with the guards, then stepped back, revealing Istvay standing in the center, their eyes frantically scanning the crowd. The relief that flooded Aran's body at the sight was almost enough to make him weak. "Istvay!" he called, and Istvay's head jerked up. Their posture relaxed visibly when they saw Aran. "Is everyone all right here?" they asked, their voice tense. Aran shrugged helplessly. "We managed to talk the guards into giving us water at least, but Feliu and the others aren't in good shape." "You? What did—" Istvay shook their head shortly. "We can talk later. They brought me out so I could fetch the rest of you. They said since we're here on a diplomatic mission, they'd like to put us up in some more comfortable quarters." Aran crossed over to his friend, and the guards stepped back at his approach, raising their weapons. He ignored them. "Istvay," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something here isn't right." "I know," said Istvay, lowering their voice. "I know, but—" They glanced around at the others, and Aran followed their gaze. He drew in a long breath. Istvay was right. Even if they could escape, where would they go? The badly injured were unlikely to last the night without care. "Yeah," he said at last. "You're right. We'll talk inside." "Come on, help me get them up." Istvay's tone was grim. Together, Aran and Istvay and the rest of the able-bodied members of the crew got the injured to their feet. "Where's that woman, Joska? She was helping earlier, wasn't she?" asked Istvay, glancing around. Aran frowned. "I haven't seen her since we got here." Istvay shook their head, lips tight. "Maybe she saw her chance and made a break for it. I can't blame her. We'll just have to hope it's that, and not that she got herself killed somehow between the jungle and here." Aran nodded, biting the inside of his cheek. But there was nothing they could do about it now. The aliens waited patiently, and when they were all on their feet, gestured them forward. They were led through the courtyard and into one of the low-roofed buildings off to one side, and it wasn't until they were inside, with hazy, floating lights illuminating the passageways, that Aran realized how dark it had grown. He glanced over at Istvay as they walked, but Istvay seemed lost in their own thoughts, the worry that had never really left their face since the moment Aran had told them about this damn mission cutting a sharp line between their brows. The survivors were deposited at last in a large circular room, with short, dead-end hallways running off to each side with doors along them, likely bedchambers. There was another room, rectangular and encased by glass so that it could easily be seen from the rotunda, with what were unmistakably medical cots and equipment laid out. Two of the aliens stepped forward, taking Felyu and the other injured members of the party from the rest of the crew and situated them comfortably onto the small, sterile-looking cots. They've sent in, I don't know, veterinarians, from what I gathered, said Istvay, a wry note in their voice. Probably the best option, considering I have no idea how similar their physiology is to ours. They sighed and laid a hand on Iran's arm. Come on, Alba and the others are in the far room. There was something in their voice that made Iran look at them sharply. He followed Istvay into the small room where Alba, Inez, and Josip waited, seated on the ubiquitous cushioned stools. Istvay gestured him to a seat and sat as well. What happened? Asked Iran, looking around at the tense faces of the others. Istvay shook their head uneasily, glancing at Alba. The aliens had an interpreter who could speak our language. Inez says it's hypothetically possible they could have a translation program that could pick up our language and translate it in a matter of hours, but this seemed like something else. And even if they'd had a program, the dialect they were speaking wasn't the one we use. Iran nodded absently, chewing on the inside of his cheek. It was the old dialect, right? Istvay turned to him, frowning. What? Pishti, he said. Do you remember that generation ship colony in the Labyrinto system, the one we missed our last contact with? Istvay's frown deepened. What are you saying? I heard some alien children outside the gates this afternoon. They were playing a clapping game. He hummed the tune, and Istvay started violently. Are you sure you weren't mishearing? They asked at last. Iran shook his head again. I don't know their language, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't have words in it like this. He sang a few bars of the ditty. Istvay was still staring at him, their face pale. From the corner of his eye, Iran could see the others staring as well. That's not all, he continued. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the ball with the maker's mark and tossed it to his friend. Istvay stared at it, turning it over and over in their hands. At last, they handed it over to Alba, their face drawn with shock. For a few long moments, as Alba handled the object, then handed it on, there was utter silence in the room. Iran forced himself to focus on Istvay, their familiar, concerned brown eyes framed by dark lashes. Because if he didn't, he wasn't certain that the terror of this whole thing wouldn't simply rise up and swallow him whole. When Alba spoke, her voice was sharp. I suppose, then, we must assume these aliens have been in contact with humans prior to us. Istvay's expression was grim. I don't think that's all we can assume. There are aliens here who understand our language, and their children play human games. But I haven't seen a single sign of a human besides us since our arrival. If they'd wanted to speak with us, sending out a human to open communications would be their easiest option if there were humans here. Living ones, at any rate. There was another long moment of silence, and the unease that had been twisting, formless and insubstantial in Iran's chest, crystallized into a cold, sharp dread. You make a valid point, Istvay. Even Josip's friendly face was creased in concern. But we can't assume, necessarily, that they attacked or killed the Labyrinto settlement. It's possible they had peaceful contact with them, and that's where their familiarity with humanity comes from. Possible, yes, but even you must admit it's unlikely, said Alba. Josip gave her a small smile. Perhaps you're right, but I don't believe in borrowing trouble until we need it. He glanced around the room. And right now, I don't think we need any more trouble than we have. We're trapped here until we find a way to get them to open the portal, and even if they'd let us go, I don't think much of our chances in the jungle. Alba nodded slowly. However the aliens learned our language, our original mission must be paramount. We must negotiate with these creatures and do our best to persuade them to interact with our society on peaceful terms. That, obviously, is our first objective. However, she paused a moment. However, before we negotiate for the reopening of the portal, we must find out what they truly want. Because if they did, in fact, enter into hostilities with another human settlement. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and for just a moment Aran could see the exhaustion and weariness and something that was almost despair written across her features. But when she opened her eyes again, her voice was firm. If they have hostile intentions against humanity, our mission must be to find a way to keep them from reopening the portal at all. There was a long moment of silence. At last, Josip nodded. I agree with your caution, madam, he said. We'd do well to be wary of their motives, but the portal was open for several days, and besides the box, nothing was sent through. We were the ones who came to them, not the other way around. This gives some credence to the idea that this might be no more than a misunderstanding. And if they can reopen the portal, as we assume, then we may not be able to prevent them from doing it if we wish to. Diplomacy may be the only hope, not only for those of us stranded here, but for the Joias System itself. Istve raised their head. The gesture was so weary that Aran reached out an unconscious hand to steady them. They gave him a brief smile, then turned to Alba, their face set in its familiar, stubborn lines. Their eyes were dark with worry, their hair pulling out of its ponytail and plastered to their skin with sweat, smudges of dirt across their face and the dark circles under their eyes making them look younger than they were, tired and uncertain. I honestly don't know that we have another choice at this point, they said quietly. Have you seen the shape some of the people in our party are in? We're at these aliens' mercy whether we like it or not. So I guess if diplomacy can keep us alive. They gave an exhausted shrug. Aran, what's your verdict? Asked Josip quietly. Aran took a long breath. He had no idea whether the aliens would be ultimately hostile or friendly, but at the end of the day, none of it changed one cold fact. What these creatures had sent through the portal weeks earlier had shown that they were familiar with the genetic defect that was slowly killing Istve, and that they'd found a cure for it. And for that, well, he'd happily ignore everything else. His verdict had been set from the moment he'd agreed to come on this mission. I agree, he said in a flat voice. We stay. He could feel Istve's eyes on him, and he could picture the worry on their face. It didn't matter, though. He'd told Alba, back on the escape pod, he was here to find a cure for the defect. A cure for Istve. Anything else was irrelevant. Very well, said Alba at last. I'm meeting with their ambassador tomorrow. Tonight we should eat and rest, and regain as much of our strength and our wits as we can. If the fate of the Joias System and every person living there depends on our making the correct decisions, I'd prefer those decisions be made with all our faculties present. She paused, then added in a voice so low she could have been talking to herself, and may the great mystery keep and preserve us all. Chapter 6. Savina. Savina stepped forward quickly, her heart beating hard and fast, to shield her baby brother with her body, well, as much as she could, since he had about 20 centimeters on her in height. Benny, she whispered into her wavelength, I'll take out the leader. You grab Nicola and... Someone touched her arm, and she looked up, startled, her hand gripping the knife at her belt. Joska stood beside her, face grim. Listen to me, Savina, she said quietly. You've seen what their weapons do. If you fight, you'll die. And if I don't fight, we all die, Savina hissed. She forced her innocent smile. Besides, you have no idea how efficient I can be when I need to. Joska shook her head, something so close to sympathy in her eyes that it made Savina's stomach twist. You'd be sacrificing yourself for nothing. There's no guarantee any of us will get out either way, but if they'd wanted us dead, they'd have killed us already. It's worth seeing what they do want. Savina hesitated. Joska gave her a wry look. Some of us don't use killing as our go-to option in our day-to-day interactions. It is possible to negotiate tricky situations without anyone dying. Trust me on this, okay? Savina tightened her fist around the knife. The aliens gripped their own weapons tighter. Damn it to hell. She didn't trust Joska. She couldn't trust her. And yet, slowly, she loosened her grip on her knife, dropping her hands back to her side. Joska gave a faint nod of approval. She stepped up beside Savina, her own hands empty of weapons, and Savina noticed how Joska's movement had positioned the woman between Nicolau and the aliens as well, as if she understood how important it was to Savina to keep him safe. She bit back the traitorous trickle of gratitude in her chest. Damn Joska to the void. "Benny," she whispered, "we'll have to do what the good captain says, since we've just given up our other options. Let's hope she's as smart as she thinks she is." She made no effort to disguise the sarcasm in her tone. The alien in the front of the group, blood still running down its shoulder and soaking its tunic, gave a growling command. Its eyes, fixed on Savina, were bright with hostility, but it didn't fire its weapon. 2 aliens came forward and patted the humans down with brusque efficiency. They removed several of Savina's knives, her pulse gun, her pistol, her pouch of electric tranks, a bolas, 3 restraints, and various other accoutrements. Joska watched with raised eyebrows, and Savina glowered at her. "If we die because of you," Savina hissed as the aliens turned their attention to Benny, "from what I saw there, if you'd tripped, you'd have killed every last one of us on accident," said the woman dryly. The aliens disarmed Joska next. It was a much shorter process, a pistol and bushblade and a couple of restraints stored carefully in her jacket pocket. Nicolau carried no weapons except for the ship's utility blade strapped to the belt of his uniform. "One utility knife. Hard to believe he's our brother," Savina muttered into Benny's line on her wavelength. Benny gave her a small smile, but Savina could see the fear in their expression. When the aliens had finished disarming the 5 of them, they wrenched the humans' hands behind their back and bound them together with some sort of clip-on restraint. "What the hell do you want?" growled Savina to the alien who was binding her, the one with the bloody tunic. It glared back and snarled something in its own language that could have been an answer, or could have been a threat. Then a thick strip of fabric was tied over Savina's eyes, blocking out all but a faint sliver of light from the gap where it lifted over the bridge of her nose. The alien barked a command, and Savina was shoved forward, the hard muzzle of an alien weapon pressed against her back. The streets, as pretty as they looked from a distance, were neither smooth nor clean, judging from the number of times Savina stumbled. She could hear the others stumbling along beside her. "So, Captain, how many times have you negotiated with people who couldn't speak your damn language?" Savina snapped at Joska through her wavelength. "Maybe your brilliant idea wasn't so brilliant after all." "Considering the alternative was instant death, I'm comfortable with my choice." Savina could almost see the woman's wry expression, the twitch of amusement in the corner of her mouth. She scowled harder. At last, the aliens pulled them roughly to a halt. Savina could feel bruises rising along her entire damn body from where she'd bumped into walls or stubbed her toes against detritus in the street. Their captors were consulting, not bothering to keep their voices down. Not that it mattered. She couldn't understand a word they were saying. But they seemed to come to a decision at last, because again someone barked a command, and she felt herself shoved forward once more. "Vina, it's—" Benny's voice through the wavelength was a moment too late. Savina stumbled as the ground disappeared from under her and would have fallen all the way down what appeared to be a flight of stairs had one of the aliens not grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her back upright. She stepped more cautiously this time, feeling for the next stair step down with her foot. Her whole body was trembling from the shock of the near fall and everything that had gone before it. She bit down hard on her teeth. This wasn't the time to fall apart. That could come later. Right now she had to keep herself and her siblings and that idiot ship's captain and her crew alive. Behind them, she could hear the click of a door latching shut. The air here was cool and clammy, a sharp contrast from the thick, suffocating heat of the city streets. She was prodded down a corridor, and then another long set of stairs before she was at last jerked to a stop and the blindfold yanked from her eyes. She barely had time to catch a brief, confused glimpse of a small, dank room, and then she was pushed towards a rope ladder that led into a hole in the ground. Disarmed and disoriented, she hardly had a choice. She went, and the others followed. When she reached the bottom, she blinked in the darkness, trying to orient herself to her surroundings. They were in a small, bare space that seemed to have been hollowed out of dirt and rock. It was cool and unpleasantly clammy, and the only feature it seemed to boast was the trapdoor above them. Raphael, the last one down, stepped unsteadily down onto the floor. The rope ladder was pulled up, and the trapdoor slammed closed, and even that bit of light disappeared. For a while, none of them spoke. Well, one similarity between these bastards and humans, Raphael grumbled at last. We both have similar ideas on what to do with people we don't like. Let's hope so, anyway, said Benny. I've heard stories about aliens eating people they captured. Savina rolled her eyes in the darkness. Benny and their romance stories. Benny? She asked. What's the cell like? Benny paused. It's not very big, 4 meters by 4 meters, maybe. The walls are rough enough that it seems like it was just hollowed out of the ground. The roof is maybe 2 meters or so over my head if I was standing up, and the trapdoor seems to be the only entrance or exit. Thanks, said Savina shortly. Thank goodness for Benny's echolocator. Sometimes, knowing your surroundings was as good as a weapon. And Savina reached down gently to touch the thin, needle-like electric blade tucked into the seam of her trousers, on the inside of her calf. It wasn't much, but at least it was backup for when Joska's stupid plan failed. Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'd almost be okay with the aliens eating us as long as they fed us first. Nicolao's voice was trying to be stoic, but there was a note to it that told Savina his feigned nonchalance was mostly an attempt to stave off panic. She turned her head towards him in the dark. He seemed hardly changed from the child he'd been at 5 years old. Aside from his height and the way his voice had deepened, he had that same naive, cheerful innocence that made her want to both grab him in her arms and protect him and hit him in the face for being such an idiot. I'd trade all the food they'd give us in exchange for eating you for a bottle of water anyway, she grumbled at last. There was a moment of silence. Then Nicolao laughed, a surprised, friendly, pleasant sound. He seemed startled that she deigned to speak to him at all. She rolled her eyes and settled back against the clammy wall of their cell. Captain, said Raphael at last, quietly, do you suppose they'll just leave us in here to die? Joska shifted, and when she spoke, Savina was surprised at the weariness in her tone. They'll take us out, eventually, she said. They wouldn't have taken the trouble of bringing us here alive if they didn't want something with us. Savina realized suddenly that she hadn't seen the woman take even a moment to rest or eat since they'd fled the dying ship, however long ago that had been. And Joska certainly wasn't superhuman. Raphael grunted. Let's just hope Benny isn't right about their intentions. Joska chuckled. After the last few days we've had, I doubt anyone would look at us and start drooling. Savina found she was smiling unconsciously at the familiar, friendly banter. It had been so long, almost her whole life, really, since she'd had anyone other than Benny she could talk to, that she could trust enough to banter with and not calculate every word that came out of her mouth. The thought sparked a strange jolt of longing, and she pushed it away determinedly. There was a reason she couldn't trust anyone. She tamped down the strange, uneasy restlessness at the memory of the hollow discs she'd found in Alba's safe, while she was lying in wait to kill the woman, before the mutiny had sparked, dragging her and the others down with it. It wasn't true. There was no way that what she'd read there was true, that the stories she'd heard her whole life in the compound of how the Orthodox Church was lying in wait with secret plans to murder the Corpus Dei Old Believers were no more than stories. The discs had to have been a lie, a trap of some sort, something planted there to get her to let down her guard. But that didn't get rid of that small, nagging tug of unease in the back of her brain. She gave an exasperated sigh, tipping her head back against the cold cell wall. It didn't matter. Until they got out of whatever the hell situation they'd gotten into here, none of it mattered at all. Nicolao cleared his throat uncomfortably. I'm sorry. Savina looked up, startled. If that thing hadn't have grabbed me or you hadn't come after me... Shut up, said Savina, rolling her eyes. There were a few moments of silence. And Savina, he continued at last. I mean, I'm very grateful, but why did you... I said, shut up! She scowled at her brother in the darkness, even though he probably couldn't see. This was neither the time nor the place to break the news to him about who his real family was. She'd prefer never to break that particular news to him if she could help it. For a while, no one spoke, and then a sound from above made Savina jump, and she looked up in time to see an outline of light edge the trap door as it was pulled back. The ladder was dropped down again, and the aliens barked something from above. Savina looked around at the others and stood, but Nicolau stepped in front of her, jaw set in determination. He hoisted himself easily up the ladder, and Savina followed, clenching her teeth to keep from swearing at her brother's stubbornness. The others followed, and at last they were standing in a huddled group in the corridor. The alien waiting for them, at the top, was the one Savina had injured. It had changed its clothing, but there was the bulk of a bandage under its tunic, and it held its arm as if it hurt. Savina met the creature's gaze, and smirked. The alien narrowed its eyes, glaring at her with enough hostility she could almost feel the heat of the glare. At least some languages seemed to be universal, even in this hellscape. The alien grabbed her by the arm and turned, snapping something over its shoulder. It shoved Savina, and she stumbled forwards, the muzzle of the alien's weapon firmly between her ribs. She could hear the others stumbling after her. They went up 2 sets of stairs, and then another, until at last they were being pushed down a corridor that had once, probably, been brightly lit. It was built of a glass-like substance that reflected the light strangely, but it was old and grimy, as if it hadn't been cleaned for some time. Savina's guide pulled her roughly to a halt in front of a door and called in a respectful sing-song. The tone was repeated back a moment later, and her captor shoved the door open and pushed Savina inside. Savina glanced around quickly as she entered. In front of her, there was a rising, winding column of seats in a stair-step pattern, the design as airy and delicate as the rest of the architecture in this city. The seats were empty, except for the one in the center. And Savina knew at once that this was who they'd been brought to see. There was something universal and unmistakable about the lazy slouch of the creature's posture, the half-lidded eyes, the way it lounged back, watching the room. Guards stood on each side, weapons leveled at Savina and her companions, but the figure on the seat seemed unbothered. The seated alien gestured lazily to a cluster of squat stools on the floor, and Savina's guard shoved her into the seat. The other humans were directed with a little less roughness to their own seats. Savina's breath was coming quickly, but she forced herself to appear relaxed. It wouldn't be easy to get at her concealed blade, bound as she was, but not easy didn't mean impossible. If she could just tuck her leg far enough back, she could lean down as if she was scratching an itch or rubbing a bruise and palm it. And then she only needed to get herself close enough to the alien boss. The alien who'd taken her captive and the boss were apparently having a detailed discussion. The boss kept making the small humming sounds, while Savina's captor was clearly growing more and more irate. Savina let herself slump a little, as if she was too weary to sit up straight, and tucked her feet under the stool as far back as she could. Not quite close enough. She let her shoulders drop lower, yawning hugely. The guards stiffened at her movement, then relaxed. She hid a smile. And then a light, sing-song voice said, with an air of command that was almost incongruous to the delicacy of the tone, "Human, it seems you and I have some matters to discuss." Savina jerked her head up, blinking in complete shock. The alien looked down at her from its seat, an unmistakable satisfaction in its posture at her discomfiture. "What, human? Do you not understand your own language?" The creature's accent was strange and unfamiliar, closer to a mountain dialect accent, although it wasn't really that either, and its manner of speaking was stilted and odd. But the words were unmistakable for all that. Savina blinked out of her shock and said, her voice only a little unsteady, "I don't discuss things with people who are trying to kill me." It was childish, probably, but she was too surprised to think of a better retort. The alien hummed softly. If I'd wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead, so I suggest you talk while you have the chance. What do you want to talk about, then? Snapped Savina. She could feel Joska's warning gaze, but between the strain and the exhaustion and fear of the last few days, she could hardly be bothered to care. We saw a group of humans being brought through our city, and I instructed my people to bring one of the bigger ones here so I could make them an offer. I could use their help with our business. There was a tiniest hesitation before the word. Your business. You're a crime boss, Savina said, her voice flat. And you tried to kidnap him. The alien tipped its chin back. Perhaps I am. Although, from what my people tell me, you're not someone who shies away from killing. If I understand human customs correctly, murder is frowned on. So what does that make you? Why were you trying to take Nicolau? She countered. The alien hummed again, and Savina realized with shock that the sound must be the alien's equivalent of laughter. You have quite a belligerent attitude for someone entirely at my mercy. Savina took a deep breath, struggling to regain her composure. She could still play this. In fact, this was probably advantageous. If the aliens knew their language, it would be easier to fool them. She wouldn't let herself think too hard right now about the implications of the aliens' knowledge, or of their obvious familiarity with humans. She let her lips curve into an innocent smile. The reactions of the aliens around her seemed almost reflexive. The guards took a quick step back, hands tightening on their weapons. Interesting. Not the reaction she'd expected, but perhaps something she could use. She widened her eyes instead, as she'd seen the aliens do when they greeted each other. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to kill anyone, I promise. I was just so frightened, and they were hurting my friend. I didn't know what they were going to do with him. I never wanted to hurt anyone. If there's something I can do to pay you back. Her tone was one of frightened innocence, her expression terrified and sincere. The guards, at least, seemed to relax a little. Savina smiled to herself. They'd let her and the others go back to the main party eventually. Or if they didn't, they'd let down their guard just enough. And then she'd kill them all, slowly and painfully. And she'd enjoy every moment, every scream. I'm afraid I can't let you back to your friends just yet, the boss said. We have some unfinished business, you and me. You killed one of my people and injured 2 others. That requires an answer. The alien boss leaned forward a little, hands on its knees, and studied Savina with open interest. I've seen people kill others by accident. They don't drive the point of a blade through both their opponent's shoulders, so they'll bleed out slowly. They don't nail their victims to the wall and then laugh in their faces, so let's be honest with each other. Let's say we made a bargain. The lives of you and your friends in exchange for your service. The alien gestured towards Nicolau. I told my people to capture one of the bigger humans, like that one behind you. You humans are good for intimidation, with the sizes you grow to. But when I heard what you'd done, I realized I'd miscalculated. I think you are what I need instead. There are some upstarts challenging my territory. You go out, do some tasks for me, just some simple kills, nothing you'd find difficult, I think. And in exchange, I don't kill your friends. The alien shrugged. Perhaps one day you even buy back your freedom if you're useful enough. Savina had slouched a little farther as she listened, and her fingertips brushed the end of her needle-thin electric knife. A jump to her feet, a quick lunge. And then what? There were guards all around the room. The others would be dead before she had time to throw her knife. She gritted her teeth. Sometimes you had to be patient. Sometimes a job took more finesse than you'd been anticipating. But one day, this mob boss would regret the moment it had laid eyes on Savina. I guess, like you said, I don't have much of a choice, she said, widening her eyes innocently. From the edge of her vision, she could see Joska relax, and it was only then she realized how tense the woman had been. I'll do kills for you, said Savina, and you'll keep my friends safe. She leaned forward just a bit and smiled. The aliens around her tensed, their weapons coming up. and for a moment the room was frozen. "And if you don't," she said into the silence, "if I find even one of them hurt or injured or mistreated, know this, I will kill you all. You think you have the upper hand here, but the moment I lose my reason not to hurt you..." Her fingers closed around the hilt of the knife. She jerked it out, flipped it between her fingers, and sliced through the restraints binding her wrists, and stood quickly. The guards jumped backwards, their weapons trained on her, and she raised her hands, still smiling, and lowered the knife to the ground. "So," she said, "now that we understand each other, I suppose it's just a matter of working out details." "I suppose it is," said the mob boss. But the alien's eyes, as it watched her, were cold and calculating, and Savina had to fight back a shiver. They were alone on an alien planet. The only person who'd noticed her disappearance was a woman sworn to murder her. And for all her bravado, she was at these aliens' mercy. And so were Benny and Nicolau and the others, and if she didn't find them a way out, they would all die. Of that, she had no question.